Okay, in this video we're going to take a look at the basics of entity relationship modeling. Entity relationship modeling is basically how you express database designs, and ER models consist of entities, attributes and relationships. And it's not just, well, part of the initial aspect of design is to work out what kind of entities are involved in the system, what characteristics those entities have. The characteristics become the attributes, and then how the entities are related to each other. So for this video we want to take a look at a very common scenario where we're dealing with people. So let's start with a person entity, which would be a very common place to start. Okay, so what information do we want to know about person or people? We want to know their names, want to know where they live, potentially want to know when they were born or how old they are, what gender they are perhaps. And for this scenario we're going to throw in the fact that they might be interested in various kinds of foods as well, so their favourite cuisines. So we've got person as an entity. First kind of attribute we might be interested in is their name. Second kind of attribute we might be interested in is their address. So let's start with these two first of all. Now if you think back to the requirements, it said we're interested in their name. Possibly we're just interested in their name as a string, John Shepherd. But in the in the requirements it said we might be interested in separating out the given name and the family name. That's quite a common thing to do because you might want to get a list of people sorted by their family name, and of course if you simply do their name as a string it's going to sort by their first name. So in ER modeling notation that would be a composite attribute. So we've got name, which is actually made up of a set of given names, a string containing their given names I should say, and a family name. So those two things, the given name and the family name, represent the person's name, and they're, in fact, in the relational model they're going to be represented by separate attributes. All right, for address we had the street that they live on, and we had the town that they live in, and some kind of postal code, and the country, assuming that we're dealing with people from many parts of the world. And of course you might have other kinds of things, but for the sake of this scenario that was all that was mentioned in the requirements. Okay, so once again, composite attribute consisting of 4 parts. If we split the address up like this rather than treating it as a single string, then we can ask queries later on about, you know, who are all the people from Australia. If the addresses were done as a single string, it's a little bit more complicated to talk about that kind of information. All right, next thing, what have we got? Oh, age or date of birth. Now, age is an interesting one. You could store age as an integer, but the problem is the age is going to be fine when you initially enter information about that person, but next year they're going to have a different age. The year after that they're going to have a different age. So you don't really want to have to update the age every year. So normally what we do is store values that don't change much, and in this case we could store their date of birth. Now if we want to consider their age, we could certainly add an additional attribute to the scenario to show that we're interested in age, but in this case it's not going to be, if you like, a hard attribute. It's going to be a derived attribute, and it's going to be derived based on the date of birth, and that's how we indicate derived attributes in the notation that we're using. Okay, so a dotted attribute oval gives you the age. So once again, this is saying that age is a derived attribute. At this stage, we don't actually say what it's derived from, but you know, it's pretty obvious that it's going to be derived from the date of birth. Okay, other things that we had in our setup. Here's a much simpler scenario. We have perhaps the gender. Okay, so that's a straightforward single attribute. Nowadays it may not be so straightforward what values you're going to put in it, but that from a database design perspective, that's reasonably simple. The next thing that we might be interested in is their place of birth. Now, potentially, you know, the place of birth could be an address. You might want that much detail, but in this case, possibly all that we're interested in is the country they were born in. And so we could have another single attribute which just contains the name of the country where they were born. Okay, the final attribute that we're interested in, or the final characteristics of a person that we're interested in, is their favourite foods now, or their favourite cuisines. Now in this case, it's not just a single cuisine, so we can't have a single attribute that because we've got multiple values that we want to store in it. So we indicate that by using a different notation for multi-valued attributes. And basically what we're saying there, it's an attribute where there are several values associated with that property. And we indicate that in our notation by a double oval, and that's kind of plausible, that one. And so that could contain a collection of this person's favourite cuisines. Okay, and that illustrates all of the different kinds of attribute types that you might find in a database scenario. So we've got the main entity person, several composite attributes, a derived attribute, a multi-valued attribute, and the other attributes are simple. So that's our initial look at modelling entities and their corresponding properties.